Good afternoon. I'm Dan DeRose with 19 News, coming to you from our digital desk. We're about to have the conversation of what is next now that President Joe Biden has announced that he will not be on the November ballot. He has thrown his support behind Vice President Kamala Harris, as well as many other congressional and Senate Democrats. It remains to be seen, though, if she will in fact become the nominee. We've been waiting to see if there are any other Democrats that want to throw their hat into the ring and perhaps challenge Kamala Harris. We haven't quite seen anything on that front, but of course there are a lot of questions of what has to happen. This has been a historic couple of weeks. We have former President Donald Trump nearly assassinated. You have a sitting president who felt the pressure clearly from Democrats asking for him to step aside. And he has done just that. It has been a roller coaster 2 weeks, to say the least, and we are not done yet. November, the election is a couple of months off. So to have the conversation of what's next, we love to turn to the experts at Case Western Reserve University. We're doing that again today with Professor Jonathan Entin. He is with the School of Law at Case Western, as well as the Political Science Department. Professor, how are you today?
Fine, thanks. How are you, Don?
Thank you for joining us again on this tumultuous race, to say the least. Let's start with this question. Are we in a historic time? Is this a historic moment in American politics to have a sitting president? I believe we've had it happen once before, withdraw and not seek the nomination. I don't know that we've had it 2 months before that election is supposed to happen.
No, the timing here is unique. We have never had a sitting president who was eligible for re-election withdraw from the race this late. We've had a few presidents who decided not to seek re-election, and we've had a couple of presidents who withdrew early in the campaign. The last time we had something like this was 1968, when President Lyndon Johnson withdrew, but that came on March 31st, very early in the campaign and several months before the convention. And President Harry Truman withdrew in early 1952, but again, way before the convention. Here we are about 4 weeks from the official opening of the convention. We've never had this kind of situation this close to a convention before.
And let's talk about that convention, and let's remind people what has happened so far with primaries and caucuses. Those are events and elections that are held to determine who the delegates are supposed to nominate when they go to a convention. It's sort of this unwritten rule that if you are a delegate and your state was won by candidate X, that you are going to show up to that convention and you are going to throw your delegate, your number, your vote behind that candidate X. This now complicates things because voters who went to the polls in the spring in those primaries and in those caucuses, there was not the name Kamala Harris on that ballot. There was a name Joe Biden. There was also a minor candidate, a third-party candidate who didn't get much of the votes, or not even a third-party candidate, but another Democratic candidate. How does this now proceed into a convention where you had delegates that were promised to Joe Biden?
Let's start with the ground rules. It's not an unwritten rule. In every state where there's a primary, the elected delegates are legally required to vote for their candidate for some period of time. In some instances, it's for, say, the first ballot. In other instances, it is until the candidate releases them. What's happened here is that President Biden has released the delegates, so they are no longer legally required to vote for him. In some respects, this puts us back to an earlier time when party nominees were selected by the convention. We didn't really have primaries for convention delegates until early in the 20th century, and even then, only in a handful of states. It's only in the last 50 or so years that virtually every state has gone to primaries, where the winning candidate in the primary gets the votes in the convention. Now, because President Biden has released the delegates, they are legally allowed to vote for anyone they choose. But as you said, if there is only one candidate placed in nomination at the convention, then that's pretty much the choice. You either vote for Vice President Harris or you don't. And as you said, at this point, because we don't have anyone else announced, it looks like Vice President Harris is on track to get the nomination. Now, let's suppose that there were another candidate interested, an announced candidate. Well, then the Democratic Party would have to invent a process for deciding how these candidates would be able to make their case. When President Johnson withdrew in 1968, as I said, there weren't as many primaries, but there were some. The rest of the primaries played out. He just wasn't on the ballot, and other candidates were. But it's too late for those sorts of elections because, as I said, we're too close to the convention. So the Democratic National Committee would have to invent a process on very short notice in order to give other people the opportunity to make their pitch. But now we've got the chicken and egg question. If there are no other candidates, do we need a process? If we don't have a process, why would anybody else throw his or her hat into the ring?
It is interesting. Is it possible that, and there are 4 weeks until the DNC being held in Chicago, is it possible that we could see a candidate pop up, or would it just be too short a notice? Not only do you have to gear up a campaign to win your party's nomination, you would now have to try and gear up a campaign, period, to win president. That takes money, that takes staff, that takes research. Is that likely to happen, that somebody pops up, or is it just too much work?
It's possible, but aside from all of those practical considerations, I think that anybody at this point who announced a challenge to Vice President Harris might face a lot of pushback in the party that could hurt that person's longer-term political prospects. Now, whether we should have a more open process is another question. But the political reality is that just as no serious challenger emerged to President Biden when he was running for re-election, it doesn't look like we're going to get a serious challenger to Vice President Harris. That may be good, may be bad. From the Democratic Party standpoint, the big challenge is, can they run a credible campaign against Donald Trump? After all, that's the ultimate election that people are concerned about. And I think we can say that, assuming that Vice President Harris winds up with a nomination, that the party's morale will be a lot greater with her at the head of the ticket than it seemed to be with Biden at the head of the ticket. But it's going to be a challenge, whoever the Democratic nominee winds up being. It's going to be a challenge because the election is going to be decided in a small number of swing states because you have to get to 270 electoral votes. Before President Biden withdrew, it looked like President Trump had the advantage in most of those swing states. Now, we ought to be a little careful here because, after all, the margins were not large. Most of them have been within the polls' margin of error, but they've generally pointed in the same direction. One more point to keep in mind. These polls are showing Trump even or ahead. In 2016 and 2020, the polls consistently understated Trump's level of support. I don't mean to say that there was some kind of a plot or anything like that, but for whatever reason, the Trump support was a handful of points lower in the polls than it turned out to be on election day. Trump was rarely, if ever, even in 2016 or 2020 in the polls. Now he's even or a little bit ahead in a lot of these polls. And that suggests that whoever the Democrats put up will face a daunting challenge. This is a winnable election for Democrats, but it's going to be a hard one because their path to 270 electoral votes is pretty narrow.
When you start thinking about those polls and how those operate, some are done by web surveys, some are done still through phone calls. You can see why the polls maybe have shorted Trump. And we're not talking about the election polls. We're talking about getting a phone call. Do you support this candidate? Who are you going to vote for? Those kinds of polls. Was there this notion of, well, I want to vote for Trump, or I'm going to vote for Trump, but I don't want to tell anybody that. It's sort of this guilty pleasure idea. That was one train of thought behind people not maybe being fully honest or even answering those polls, those questions accurately. So we'll see if that is a trend again. Let's talk about, we discussed it takes a lot of work, a lot of money to run for president. Joe Biden had been fundraising and taking in millions and millions of dollars over the past year, 2 years. What happens to that money? Is it as easy as saying, well, I'm not running? Do you send it back? Or is it as easy to say, well, since I now support Vice President Harris, I'm just going to shift it to her? What happens with those millions and millions of dollars?
That's an interesting question that I can't answer with great confidence. The Democrats have been saying that this money can be transferred over at least to Vice President Harris because she was part of the ticket for which the money was raised. But I have seen some suggestions that maybe that's not possible, that maybe that money might have to be returned, or at least the donors might have to be given the option of getting the money back. Now, the answer in the first instance is likely to come from the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission does very little fast, and we're talking about significant time constraints. It doesn't do things quickly, in part because of its structure. It has 3 Democratic members and 3 Republican members, and elections are pretty high stakes things. And so it's not surprising that many, not all, but many significant issues that get to the Federal Election Commission wind up in a 3-3 deadlock. And the commission can't really do anything in that sort of situation. Now, there might be lawsuits filed about this at some point. And again, these would have to get resolved on a really expedited basis. I would be surprised if either the Federal Election Commission or a court ordered these funds returned to the donors in the middle of the campaign. It's possible. Now, if that were to happen, that would certainly put the Democratic ticket at a disadvantage because President Biden had raised lots and lots of money. Now, Vice President Harris apparently has raised an enormous amount of money just since yesterday, but it's one thing to be adding that big pile of money to the funds that they already have. It's another thing to be starting from scratch.
Yeah, it has been an interesting 24 hours when it comes to money. Professor Entin with Case Western Reserve University, we always respect your opinion. We're going to give you the final word on this. Some people are saying, I'm sick of politics. I don't care. I've tuned out already. Others are eating this up because we've just never seen times like these. We're going to give you the final word. What should be the average person's perspective on what's happening right now? Democrats, Republicans, assassination attempts, and withdrawing from the ticket.
The main problem that we face is that the country is so divided, and we've gotten used to the idea of having two really unpopular candidates running for president. For some folks, getting President Biden's departure from the race and his replacement by somebody else, probably Vice President Harris, might change their outlook. But there are plenty of people who are unhappy as it is. There are a lot of never Trumpers, for example, who preferred Biden to Harris. And so those folks may actually be a little depressed this morning or this afternoon. On the other hand, there are people who are strongly committed to Trump who don't care who the opposition is because they're really committed to their person. And a lot of people who don't like Trump are prepared to vote for almost anybody except Trump. So I don't know that the situation has changed on the ground all that much. We have some new developments. We're going to have to sort out what they look like. But the real question is whether, as a country, we are at a point where anyone can serve as a kind of unifying force, somebody who is at least respected by folks who disagree with them. That's the big challenge that we need to be concerned about going forward.
And as you said, we've been searching for that person, it seems, for the last 20, 30 years in these elections. Professor Jonathan Entin with Case Western Reserve University, certainly appreciate the time yet again today and your expertise. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Glad to be with you.
All right, take care. Again, just wanted to get from the experts where we stand and what happens now. Again, 4 weeks to the DNC in Chicago, and a lot has to happen between then and now. And then after that, oh yeah, we have an election in November, and a lot has to get done before we even reach that point. We're going to stay on top of it. If we have any other breaking news, it'll be here on our digital platforms. Watch for our 3.5 hours of news and weather to start at 3 o'clock this afternoon on Channel 19. Until then, I'm Dan DeRose with 19 News. Have a good afternoon.
19 News is everywhere. Download our CTV apps and follow us on social media at Cleveland 19 News.